It's wild when you think about how our brains handle all the info we throw at it. It's
Yeah.
like we've got these mental sticky notes, right? For all the stuff we need right now. That's our
Oh,
short-term memory. But then there's this whole other massive storage system for everything else.
Yeah, long-term memory
Mm.
and how those two work together.
It's mind-blowing, honestly. It's how we learn, how we remember, how we, I don't know, function as humans, I guess.
It really is. And it makes me think of that Samuel Johnson quote.
Oh, yeah. Which one?
The true art of memory is the art of attention.
Yep.
Powerful stuff.
It really is. And it makes you think, right? Especially when we're talking about AI and how AI remembers things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that quote actually sets the stage perfectly for our deep dive today.
Okay, good. Lay it on me.
We're going to be exploring a totally new family of AI architectures called Titans.
Titans. Okay, I like the name. Strong.
Yeah, they're designed to overcome a big challenge in AI, giving AI models a much better long-term memory and a way more sophisticated understanding of context.
Ooh, interesting. So drawing inspiration from the human brain, like we were just talking about.
Exactly.
I like it. So for this deep dive, we're focusing on this research paper, right?
Yes. Titans, learning to memorize at test time.
Catchy title.
It is. And what we want to do today is really break this down for everyone listening.
Awesome.
We want to understand the core challenges AI faces when it's trying to process sequences of information. Like, how do you get a machine to understand not just individual pieces of data, but the flow of that data over time?
Right, right.
Then we'll look at how Titans tries to solve this, using its what they call a neural long-term memory module.
Okay, neural long-term memory.
Got it. And finally, we'll discuss why this could be a really big deal for the future of AI.
Love it. Sounds like a plan. Let's jump in. So let's start with the current state of AI memory. Where are we succeeding and where are we hitting a wall?
So for a while now, transformer architectures have really been the gold standard for sequence modeling.
Transformers, right.
And their strength comes from this mechanism called attention.
Okay, attention. I've heard of that, but remind me, how does that work?
So attention lets the model connect any piece of info within a sequence to any other piece, no matter how far apart they are.
Okay.
You can instantly see how every word in a huge document relates to every other word.
Wow. Yeah. That's a lot of connections.
It is. And that's what gives transformers such a rich understanding of context and the relationships between all of the different elements.
That makes sense. It's like the AI is building this map of how everything fits together.
It is.
But there's a catch, right? Doesn't this get super complicated when you have a really long sequence?
You're absolutely right. Here's where things get interesting. That attention mechanism, amazing for context, but computationally expensive.
Is how?
As the length of the context window grows, meaning the amount of sequence the model's looking at, the computational cost, and memory demands skyrocket.
Skyrocket, how?
It's a quadratic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So you double the input sequence length. The computation and memory needed don't just double, they quadruple.
Oh, wow. So it scales up fast.
It does, and that's a problem. Because for things like processing a whole book, the resources you'd need are just massive.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant bottleneck. So what are researchers doing about this? I've heard the term linear transformers thrown around.
That's right. Linear transformers were developed to address this very problem, to make things more efficient.
How so?
So they replace the really computationally heavy softmax function in the attention mechanism with something called a kernel function.
Kernel function. Got it.
And this change, it drastically reduces the computational and memory load, brings it down to a linear relationship with the sequence length.
So much more manageable.
Much more.
Sounds like a total win, more efficient, handles more data. What's the downside?
Well, there often is a trade-off.
Ah, okay. What is it?
In this case, linear transformers, they can lose some performance compared to standard transformers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The paper argues that this happens because, with this kernel trick, the model basically becomes a linear recurrent network, which means it starts compressing all that info from the long context into a fixed size state.
Ah, okay. So it's like trying to cram a whole movie plot into a single sentence. You're going to miss a lot of the important details.
Exactly. And this creates a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it? We turn to these linear models specifically to handle these long sequences, but then their way of compressing info makes it hard to remember everything.
Right, right. It's like they're built for length, but then they struggle to remember the beginning because they're trying to be so efficient.
Precisely.
Fascinating. So efficiency versus actually understanding. It makes you wonder if maybe we should be looking at how our memory works for some clues.
You're on the right track. This paper actually talks about that. How current AI, while drawing some inspiration from the brain, could be missing some key memory elements.
Like what?
Well, things like having separate short-term and long-term memory systems.
Which we have, obviously.
Right? And also understanding how those systems talk to each other.
Yeah.
And importantly, the ability to actively learn new things and remember, like abstractions of past events, not just the raw data.
Okay, so it's not just about how much an AI can store,
Yeah.
but about how it organizes and uses that info, like our brains do.
Exactly. And that's the driving force behind Titans. The researchers wanted to design an architecture that has these separate but connected memory modules, something more like the human brain.
So a more memory-centric approach to AI.
It's a good way to put it.
I like it. So how does this paper define memory in an AI model?
They have a very interesting perspective. They see memory as a change in the neural network that happens because of new input data. And then learning becomes the process of figuring out the best way to make those changes to memory.
Okay, so every new piece of info tweaks the system's memory in some way.
Yeah.
Interesting. So where do familiar architectures like RNNs and transformers fit into this?
It's a great lens to view them through. With
Mhm.
RNNs, their memory is this vector-valued thing called the hidden state.
Right.
Every time they process new info, they update that hidden state. But the update usually involves compressing all the past info into that fixed size vector.
So RNNs are like the ultimate note takers, constantly condensing everything into a smaller and smaller space.
That's a good analogy.
What about transformers?
Transformers, their memory actually grows as the context window grows.
Okay.
They're key and value matrices. Those are essentially the memory. And when they see new tokens, they just add that new key value info to their memory.
Yeah.
No compression within that window.
So they're more like keeping a detailed log of everything.
Yes.
Interesting. And what about linear transformers, the efficient ones?
They're similar to RNNs in that they also compress information during the memory update, but they use a fixed size matrix instead of a vector to store that compressed data.
Right. So different ways of remembering. And the
Yeah.
paper takes this memory-centric view and asks some pretty big questions, right? The questions that led to Titans.
Yes, exactly. 5 main questions. First, what's the best structure for memory in AI?
Okay, good question.
Second, what's the best way to update that memory with new info? Make it efficient and accurate.
Right.
Third, how do we retrieve the right info from memory when we need it?
Makes sense.
Fourth, how can we design an AI system that has multiple interconnected memory modules, just like the human brain?
Ambitious. I like it.
And fifth, do AI systems need deep memory modules to effectively store and recall info from way back in the past?
So it's all about taking inspiration from how we remember things and applying it to AI. Really interesting questions.
It is, and this leads us to the heart of the paper,
Mhm.
the neural long-term memory module.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What is it and how does it work?
It's really innovative. Think of it as a meta model. It actually learns how to memorize new data into its own parameters at test time.
Wait, at test time, isn't memorization usually a bad thing during training? Doesn't that lead to overfitting?
You're right. Traditionally, we want AI models to learn general patterns, not just memorize the training data. But Titans do something different. Their long-term memory isn't trying to memorize the training data. It's learning how to memorize new data it sees later, during testing or in real-world use, without overfitting to the training data.
Okay, so it learns how to learn and remember. I see the difference.
Exactly.
Now, the paper also mentions using surprise as a guiding principle for this memory module.
Yes. They draw inspiration from human memory. You know how surprising events tend to stick with you?
Of course.
Well, they created this surprise metric for the AI.
What does that mean?
At first, they defined surprise as how much the neural network's output changes in response to new input. Big change equals big surprise. But then they realized that just looking at the immediate surprise might cause the model to miss other important info that comes right after.
Right, like if you're startled by a loud noise, you might miss what someone says next.
Exactly. So they improved the surprise metric. It now takes into account the past surprise, like a momentum term, along with the momentary surprise.
Interesting. So it's not just about how surprising the current moment is, but also how surprising things have been recently. Makes sense. And there's something about data-dependent decay terms.
Yes. These terms control how the surprise level changes over time and context. They let the model adjust how sensitive it is to surprise based on the data it's seeing.
Cool. So it's a dynamic system. It adapts.
It does.
Okay, so we've got this memory module that learns to memorize, guided by this concept of surprise. But what kind of memory are we talking about here? The paper mentions associative memory.
That's right. Associative memory is all about learning relationships between things, like linking a word to its meaning.
Got it.
So in Titans, the input tokens are turned into keys and values.
Key value pairs. I've heard that before.
And the memory module's job is to learn how those keys and values are connected.
Okay.
And they use a specific loss function that measures how well the memory can predict the correct value when given a key. It's all about learning those associations.
Makes sense. Now, one thing I've been wondering about is forgetting. If this memory is constantly learning and storing new stuff, it can't keep everything forever, right?
You're absolutely right. Forgetting is actually a key part of making this work,
Oh, wow.
especially with really long sequences.
So how does Titans handle that?
They have this adaptive forgetting mechanism. It's a gate that controls how much of the old info in the memory is kept.
So it can decide to hold on to the past or let go of some of it?
Exactly. And they found that this is actually similar to how gating mechanisms work in RNNs, which have been very successful.
Clever. So it's got a way of pruning its memory to keep things manageable.
It does.
Now, what about the structure of this long-term memory module? The paper mentions using simple MLPs.
Yeah, for this initial research, they focused on MLP's multi-layer perceptrons as the basic building blocks, with one or more layers.
So like the neurons in our brain.
Kind of.
Mm,
And even simple MLPs with more than one layer can be more powerful than linear memory. They can learn more complex patterns.
interesting.
And their results show that this is true. But they also say that this opens up a whole new area for research, finding even better architectures for memorization.
Okay, so MLPs are a good starting point, but there's room for improvement.
Right.
Now, when the system needs to use this memory, how does it retrieve information?
It's pretty straightforward. Once the memory module is trained or is actively learning, you just give it a query. And the memory network gives you the associated information.
Like a Google search, but for the AI's own internal memory.
Yeah, something like that.
Cool. And training these long-term memory modules must be computationally intensive, especially if we're talking about online learning. They mentioned something about parallelizing the training.
Yes. To speed things up and make the most of modern hardware, they figured out a way to parallelize the training of this long-term memory module
Okay, so making it faster.
much faster.
How?
They essentially broke down the training process into smaller chunks that can be processed simultaneously.
Smart. So we've got this memory module that learns, remembers, forgets, and can be trained efficiently. But how do we actually build it into a full AI system?
It's where the Titans family of architectures comes in, and they have three main variations.
Okay, let's go through them. What's the first one?
The first one is called Memory as a Context, or MX.
MS. All right, what's that about?
In MS, the long-term memory and the persistent memory are basically combined with the current input, and then the attention mechanism looks at all of it together.
So the attention is getting a much broader view.
It is. It can decide if it needs info from the long-term memory, and it helps the long-term memory know what's important to store.
I see. So the short-term and long-term memory are working closely together.
Exactly.
What about the second variant?
That's gated memory, or MAG.
MAG. All right, what's the difference?
MAG is more modular. It uses sliding window attention for short-term memory and the neural long-term memory at the same time. And then there's a gate that decides which one to use at any given moment.
So it's like having two memory systems working in parallel and a switch to choose between them.
That's a good way to think about it.
Interesting.
And the last one,
That's memory as a layer, or MAL.
MAL. Okay, how does that one work?
In MAL, the neural long-term memory processes the input first, and then its output goes into the sliding window attention. It's more of a pipeline.
So more sequential approach.
Right. And the paper suggests that this might not be as effective as a MAG or MAG, which allow for more interaction between the memory components. Okay, so different ways of combining the memory modules. And the paper mentions a theoretical advantage of Titans when it comes to state tracking.
Yes. They show that theoretically, Titans can solve certain types of problems that standard transformers and some other models can't.
Meaning,
It means Titans are better at tracking how things change over time. which is important for tasks that need to keep track of long-term dependencies and make complex decisions.
Got it. So all of this is fascinating in theory, but what about the real world? How well do Titans actually perform?
The results are very impressive.
Okay, tell me about it.
In language modeling and common sense reasoning tasks, Titans often did better than state-of-the-art linear recurrent models, and they were even as good as or better than standard transformers using the same context window.
Wow.
And in these tasks, MAC and MAG often did better than ML, which shows that the way you integrate the memory really matters.
Makes sense. What about tasks specifically designed to test long-term memory, like that needle in a haystack task?
Yeah, great example. In that task, the goal is to find a specific piece of information hidden in a huge amount of text.
Hard.
It is. And the linear memory module, or LMM, on its own, did the best. It could handle longer and longer sequences without losing accuracy.
Really?
Yeah. They think this is because of its smart memory management, like the momentum and forgetting we talked about.
Makes sense. What about the hybrid Titans variants?
They did very well too. Often as good as or better than the LMM alone.
That's impressive. They also tested Titans on that Babylon benchmark, right? The one for long context reasoning.
They did. And the results there were amazing. MC actually outperformed all the other models, even much bigger models like GPT-4.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, and even llama models that were augmented with retrieval mechanisms. It shows that Titans are really good at reasoning over long stretches of information.
Outperforming GPT-4, that's a big deal.
It is. They also looked at the effect of using a deeper memory module, meaning a module with more layers.
Right. What would they find?
Generally, deeper memory led to better performance. But it took a bit longer to train.
So a trade-off there. More power, but more time.
Right.
They also tested Titans on tasks beyond language, right? Like time series forecasting and DNA modeling.
It did, to see how adaptable it is.
Yeah.
And they found that it could actually do really well in those areas too.
Cool. So it's not just limited to language?
It's not.
What about efficiency? How fast is it to train Titans compared to other models?
The ML variant could actually be faster than some other models because of its optimized attention.
Okay.
The LMM alone was a bit slower than some really optimized linear recurrent models, maybe because of the deeper memory and the way it updates.
So some trade-offs there depending on the architecture.
Right. And finally, they did what's called an ablation study.
What's that?
It's where you remove or change different parts of the system to see what happens to the performance, to understand which parts are most important. And they found that all the key elements they added, like the deep memory, the momentum, the forgetting mechanism, they all helped improve performance.
So everything works together.
It does.
Well, this has been a really deep dive, and it sounds like Titans is a pretty big step forward in AI memory.
It is. It's a novel approach,
Mm-hmm.
and it's showing a lot of promise.
So to wrap this up for our listeners, the main takeaway is that Titans introduced this new neural long-term memory module that learns how to memorize on the fly.
Right.
And it draws inspiration from how human memory works with things like surprise and momentum and forgetting.
Exactly.
And it's doing really well in tests, handling lots of information across different tasks.
It is.
And they've explored different ways of integrating this long-term memory into the AI system, which is really important.
Very important. And it opens up a lot of new questions for future research.
Definitely. It makes you think about how these improvements in AI memory might change the world.
Yeah. Think about areas like scientific discovery or personalized education, or even understanding history better.
Right. Areas where understanding a lot of information is key.
Exactly.
It feels like we're just starting to see what AI can do when it can really remember.
We are. And for listeners who want to go deeper, the researchers are planning to release their codes soon, so keep an eye out for that.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been